It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to drive out into the woods of northern Montana. I was 29 at the time, restless and sick of my routine in the city. I had been saving up my vacation days, and when a friend told me about an old hunting cabin I could rent for cheap, I jumped on it without thinking too much. It was supposed to be simple, time away from noise, just me and the woods. The drive took me nearly 9 hours. By the time I left the paved roads and followed the dirt track that wound through thick pine trees, the sun was already sliding low. The road was uneven, full of rocks that crunched under the tires. My truck jolted over every rut, and I had to keep both hands tight on the wheel. There weren't any houses, no lights, no people. Just mile after mile of trees and the occasional dark shape of a deer vanishing back into the brush. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was almost dark. It looked old but sturdy. A squat rectangle of logs with a tin roof, a small porch, and a stack of firewood leaning against one wall. The place was surrounded by trees so dense they pressed in like a wall. I cut the engine and for the first time realized how quiet it was. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity, just the sound of the wind moving through the needles. Inside, the cabin smelled like dry wood and dust. The floorboards creaked under my boots. It had one small bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a main room with a fireplace. The furnishings were rough but solid. A table, 2 chairs, a couple of shelves with canned goods that probably hadn't been touched in years. There was no electricity, no phone, just a lantern, some matches, and a heavy metal lock on the front door. That first night, I built a fire in the stone fireplace and heated a can of soup. The crackle of the wood and the warmth were comforting, and I sat there listening to it until my eyelids grew heavy. When I finally lay down in the narrow bed, the mattress sagged under me, and the blanket smelled faintly of smoke. I thought I'd sleep easy after the long drive, but instead, I kept waking up to every noise outside. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and once, I swore I heard footsteps moving around the porch. By morning, I told myself it was just nerves. The woods had a way of amplifying everything at night. I made coffee on the propane stove, stepped outside, and tried to shake off the unease. The air was crisp, the kind that stung your lungs a little, and the ground was covered with a carpet of pine needles. It was quiet again, too quiet. I noticed tracks in the mud near the trees. At first, I figured they were animal prints, maybe a deer or elk, but some looked different, wider, more like boot prints. I tried not to dwell on it. I spent the day walking, exploring trails that twisted through the forest. The trees were so tall and thick that the sky disappeared in places. It was easy to lose track of direction, but I marked my path carefully. The further I walked, the more I noticed strange things. A rusted canteen hanging from a low branch, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a bush, small things out of place like someone else had been through there not long ago. That night, the unease returned. I was sitting by the fire when I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps outside. Not an animal, not random. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. My chest tightened, and I sat frozen, staring at the door. The fire popped loudly, and the sound outside stopped. I waited, every muscle tense, but nothing happened. After nearly an hour of silence, I forced myself into bed, though I didn't sleep much. The following morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Near the porch steps, pressed into the damp earth, were clear boot prints, bigger than my own, fresh. I crouched down, running my fingers over the edges. Whoever had been there had come close, too close. I scanned the tree line, but all I saw was shadows between the trunks. The rest of the day, I couldn't relax. Every sound seemed sharper. A branch snapping in the distance made me spin around. I carried a hatchet with me when I went to get water from the stream. I told myself it was nothing, that hunters came through here sometimes, but deep down, I knew someone had been at that cabin. That night, The sounds came back, and this time they didn't stop. I lay in bed with the blanket pulled to my chest, listening as someone circled the cabin. Slow footsteps in the dirt, pausing, then moving again. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The steps came up onto the porch. I could hear the boards creak under the weight. My heart hammered so loud I swore whoever was out there could hear it. The door latch rattled, just slightly, like a hand had tested it. Thank God for that heavy lock. I stayed awake until the first pale light of dawn seeped in through the window. When I finally got the courage to step outside, the ground was marked all around the cabin. Footprints, dozens of them, some overlapping, some circling. My mouth went dry. Whoever it was had spent hours there, walking around me while I lay inside. I thought about leaving right then, but the road was long, and the nearest town was miles away. I told myself I'd wait until morning, then drive out. I spent the day on edge, axe always in my hand, checking the tree line every few minutes. The woods felt hostile now, like they were watching me back. That final night was the worst. I barely lit the fire, afraid the glow would draw attention. I sat in the dark, listening. Hours passed, and then it started again. The footsteps. Only this time, there was no hesitation. Whoever it was moved straight up to the door. The knob twisted hard. Metal scraped against metal as if they were trying something sharp in the lock. My throat went dry. I gripped the axe so tight my hand ached. The sound went on for what felt like forever. Then suddenly silence. I didn't dare move. Minutes stretched into hours. At some point, I must have dozed off in the chair, axe across my lap, because I woke up to pale morning light. I stood, legs stiff, and opened the door slowly. What I saw made my stomach drop to my feet. The door frame was scarred, deep grooves in the wood where someone had worked at the lock with a knife or tool. They hadn't gotten in, but they had tried hard. On the porch, lying near the steps, was a single object. A hunting knife, blade stained with rust, handle worn smooth. Whoever had been there left it behind, or maybe dropped it in the dark. That was enough. I didn't waste time packing neatly. I threw everything into the truck, my hands shaking so bad I dropped my keys twice before jamming them into the ignition. I didn't look back at the cabin as I drove away. The whole ride out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following on foot. But the road stayed empty, the trees closing behind me. By the time I hit the paved highway, my jaw was aching from how hard I had been clenching it. I never went back to that cabin. I never told my friend what had happened, only said it wasn't for me. But I still think about it sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and I hear a noise outside. I think about the footprints circling me, the hand twisting at the door, the knife left behind. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't curious. They had come out there for a reason. And I know, without a doubt, if that lock hadn't held, I wouldn't be here writing this now. I was 26 when I agreed to stay at the cabin near the old graveyard on the edge of a small town in northern Pennsylvania. It was the summer of 1998, and I had been trying to get away from the noise of the city for a while. A friend of mine mentioned he knew someone who rented out an old cabin for cheap. It sat on a small hill, a few hundred feet from a cemetery that had been there since the 1800s. At first, I didn't care much about the graveyard. I wasn't superstitious, and I thought of it as nothing more than stone markers for people long gone. I wanted the quiet, the thick trees, the sound of wind instead of traffic, and that was enough reason to pack up and go. The drive out there was long and slow. I remember the highway giving way to narrow country roads, cracked and rough, with tall weeds spilling out of ditches. By the time I pulled onto the gravel lane leading to the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip behind the hills. The place looked even more isolated than I imagined. The cabin was built from old pine logs that had darkened from age, the roof sagging a little in the middle. A single chimney leaned off to one side, and the windows looked cloudy, like they hadn't been washed in decades. Beyond the cabin, through the trees, I could see the top of the graveyard fence. Iron bars bent in some places, rust covering nearly all of it. Rows of headstones poked up unevenly from the grass. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood smoke and damp earth. The floor creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the last stretch of daylight coming through the window. There was a wood stove, a narrow bed against the far wall, and a table with 2 chairs that didn't match. I set my bag down and walked through each corner, checking the place. It was simple, nothing strange, just old. I figured I would settle in, make some food, and sleep. As night fell, I sat outside on the porch. The woods around me went quiet fast, the way they do when the sun drops. Crickets started up, but even they seemed muffled. From where I sat, I could see the outline of the graveyard better. The iron fence stretched wide, and beyond it, rows of pale stones caught what little moonlight there was. A fog crept low across the grass, thin at first, then thicker, like smoke rolling along the ground. It made the stones look like they were floating. I told myself it was normal, just the way cold air settled in dips at night, but the sight of it stirred something uneasy in my stomach. That night, I struggled to sleep. The bed was lumpy, and every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking of that graveyard. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. Faint, sharp, and metallic. It wasn't inside the cabin, but outside, far off. I lay there, listening. At first, I thought it was just branches scraping the roof, but it came again. A clear clinking like metal tapping against metal. It carried through the still night air, faint but steady. I knew exactly where it was coming from, the graveyard fence. I tried to ignore it, rolled over, and pulled the blanket up, but the sound didn't stop. After a while, it changed, less like tapping and more like a dragging noise. Something metallic, scraping slowly, then stopping, then starting again. My chest felt heavy, but I told myself maybe it was an old piece of the fence moving in the wind. Though when I thought about it, there hadn't been any wind. By morning, the sound was gone. Sunlight poured through the window, and the graveyard looked ordinary again. Just stones and iron, no fog. I almost laughed at myself for being unsettled. I spent most of the day walking the woods, fishing in a narrow stream nearby, trying to clear my head. The cabin in daylight didn't feel threatening, and the graveyard in the distance looked quiet, almost peaceful. That night, though, the unease came back worse. I stayed inside after dark, reading an old paperback I had brought. The silence outside was heavy, broken every so often by the same metallic sound. This time, it wasn't just one place. It seemed to move, first near the fence, then further along, then stopping, then starting again. A dragging, scraping, clinking rhythm that made the hair on my neck rise. I blew out the lamp and sat in the dark, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something closer, footsteps on gravel. Slow, uneven, crunching in the dirt just beyond the porch. My throat went dry. I stayed still, breathing shallow, ears straining. The steps stopped near the front door, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After what felt like forever, there was a single sound, like nails lightly scratching wood on the door itself. I stayed frozen until dawn. When sunlight finally cut through the trees, I checked the porch. The gravel showed faint disturbances, not clear footprints, but areas where the stones had been pressed aside. The door had thin marks near the bottom, shallow lines, uneven, not made by an animal but by something harder, sharper. I should have left then, but I stayed. Maybe I was too stubborn. Maybe I thought I was just imagining things. I told myself it could have been some local kid messing around. Still, I started keeping my knife close at night. The third night was the worst. The noises started earlier, just after dark. Metal scraping, dragging, tapping, over and over, until I thought I would lose my mind. The footsteps came again, slower this time, circling the cabin. Gravel shifting, wood creaking, then silence, then movement again. I sat at the table, gripping the knife so hard my hand cramped. Hours passed like that, the noises never fully stopping. Just before dawn, I heard something new. A dull thud against the cabin wall, low, near the ground. Then another, then silence. When the sun rose, I stepped outside to look. In the dirt, right against the wall of the cabin, I saw it. A rusted iron bar, bent on one end, lying half buried in the soil. It looked exactly like one of the broken pieces from the graveyard fence. And beside it, pressed deep into the dirt, were long drag marks leading straight from the direction of the cemetery. That was enough. I packed my bag without eating breakfast. I didn't even look back at the cabin when I left. I drove fast down that gravel lane, past the iron fence, past the rows of stones half hidden in morning fog. For weeks after, I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't. I kept seeing those drag marks in the dirt, that iron bar pulled all the way from the graveyard to my wall. Someone or something had been moving it night after night, closer and closer. To this day, I don't know why. Maybe it was a person from the town playing some twisted game. Maybe it was just some vagrant hiding out in the graveyard. But I'll never forget the sound. The metal scraping in the dark, moving inch by inch, every single night, closer to where I slept. That cabin still stands, I've heard. The graveyard is still there too, but I'll never go back. I was 34 the year I decided to spend a few weeks alone in a small cabin in northern England, not far from the border with Scotland. It was 2016, early autumn, when the days were still long but the air had that sharp bite of cold in the evenings. I had rented the place through a small local agency. The cabin was an old one, a simple wooden structure tucked near the edge of a thick patch of woods, with only a narrow gravel track leading out to a main road. The nearest village was about 5 miles away, so I knew I'd be pretty isolated. That was the point. I wanted the quiet, wanted to be away from people, from work, from the constant background noise of my life in Leeds. The cabin itself was basic. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen with an old gas cooker, a bathroom with a water tank that sometimes coughed when the taps were turned. The floorboards were uneven in places, creaking under my weight. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the wind when it blew hard at night, pushing against the boards like a hand pressing through fabric. Out back was a small clearing, then the trees, dark and thick, their branches already beginning to shed leaves that swirled in circles on the damp ground. The first week was uneventful. I spent the mornings hiking through the nearby trails, the afternoons reading or writing in a notebook, and the evenings by the small fireplace, listening to the crack of wood as it burned. The air always smelled of pine and damp soil, and I found the silence soothing. Even the creaks of the cabin began to feel like part of the rhythm of the place. It was during the second week, late one evening, that I noticed something strange. I had been outside splitting kindling, and when I stopped to wipe the sweat from my forehead, I thought I saw movement near the treeline. Just a flicker of white between the dark trunks. I stared hard, squinting against the fading light, but nothing moved again. I figured it was a trick of the eyes, maybe a bird or just the way the low sun hit the bark. The next night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I had gone out to bring in the last of the firewood. As I stacked the pieces near the door, I glanced toward the trees. That was when I saw her for the first time. A woman standing just at the edge of the clearing. She was tall and thin, her figure wrapped in what looked like a pale coat or dress, hard to tell in the dim light. Her hair was long, hanging down the sides of her face. She didn't move, didn't step closer, didn't even seem to shift her weight. She just stood there, watching. My chest tightened. I froze with a log still in my hands. The woods were silent, too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. I don't know how long I stood staring back at her, but eventually, when I blinked, she was gone. No footsteps, no sound of her leaving, just gone. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the walls set my nerves on edge. I kept telling myself it could have been a hiker, someone lost, maybe just a local passing through. But deep down, I knew it hadn't been that. The way she stood there, still as stone, had been unnatural. The following day, I walked out to the treeline to check for footprints. The ground was soft, damp from a night of drizzle. I found nothing. No prints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been standing there. My mind tried to reason it away, but my stomach told me otherwise. For the next few days, I tried to go about things normally. I went hiking, chopped wood, cooked simple meals, but I couldn't shake the unease. I kept the curtains closed most of the time because I had started catching myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see her face there. At night, I would hear sounds outside, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, but whenever I peered out into the darkness, there was nothing. On the fifth night after that first sighting, I woke suddenly around 2 a.m. The fire had burned low, and the room was cold. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch, heavy enough to creak the old boards. One step, then another, then silence. My mouth went dry. I stayed frozen in the bed, straining my ears. The footsteps didn't continue, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I finally forced myself to get up, my legs trembling as I crossed the room. I didn't turn on any lights. I eased the curtain back a fraction and looked out at the porch. She was there, standing just a few feet from the door, her head tilted slightly as if listening. Even through the glass, I could see the pale color of her skin, the dark strands of hair framing her face. She wasn't moving. She wasn't knocking, wasn't trying the door, just standing. I let the curtain drop and backed away slowly, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I sat in the chair near the fire and waited, gripping the poker from the fireplace in my hand. I sat there for hours until the first gray light of dawn crept into the cabin. When I finally dared to look again, she was gone. That morning, I packed a bag. I told myself I would leave, that it wasn't worth it to stay. But when I went outside to load the car, I noticed something carved into the wood of the porch post. A small mark, fresh, as if scratched in during the night. It was just a simple cross, but the wood around it was still raw and pale, not yet weathered. I drove into the village and asked around casually about the cabin, about whether people came through the woods. Nobody mentioned anything unusual. They spoke of the area as if it were just another quiet rural place. I didn't bring up the woman. I didn't want them to think I was losing my mind. That evening, against my better judgment, I returned. Part of me wanted to prove it was nothing. Maybe I had been overtired. Maybe the mark on the porch had been there all along and I just hadn't noticed. I convinced myself of these things during the drive back. But the moment I pulled up and saw the cabin, saw the trees looming behind it, the same fear sank back into my stomach. That night, I sat up with every lamp on, every curtain drawn tight. I didn't sleep, and around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, the creak of the porch. This time I didn't look. I stayed where I was, rigid in the chair, until the steps faded and the night grew still. By the time dawn came, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I gathered my things quickly, shoved them into the car, and drove away without looking back. I didn't breathe easy until I saw the highway stretching out in front of me, the cabin and the woods shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back to that part of England again. I never told anyone the full story, only that I cut the trip short because I didn't like the place. But I still think about her. The way she stood at the edge of the clearing, the way she listened at the porch in the dead of night. She wasn't a ghost. She was flesh and blood, someone who knew how to move silently through those woods, someone who wanted me to know she was there but never stepped closer. That's what unsettles me most. She could have forced her way in, could have attacked me while I slept, but she didn't. She just wanted me to see her, and that thought has stayed with me every night since. I hadn't thought about that old cabin in years. It was tucked so far off the main road that most people didn't even know it existed. Back when I was married, my ex-wife used to call it her escape. She claimed it was a place to clear her mind, but I always suspected she used it to get away from me more than anything else. After the divorce, I stopped going anywhere near that side of the county. I didn't want to run into her, didn't want to see her car parked out front, didn't want to think about her at all. But a few months ago, on a cold evening in November 2013, I took a wrong turn after visiting a friend near the state forest and ended up on the back road that ran right past it. I recognized the area immediately, even though the trees had grown thicker and the brush had swallowed much of the old path. The road itself was narrow, cracked with weeds pushing through, the kind of pavement nobody had maintained in years. My headlights swept over the gravel driveway, and there it was, the cabin. I pulled over without even thinking, like some part of me needed to see it again. The place looked abandoned, but not in the ruined, falling apart sense. More like someone had locked the door one day and never bothered to come back. The wood siding was faded and dark with rain stains, and the tin roof had patches of rust. The small porch sagged slightly at the corner, and the front steps looked like they might snap under weight. What got me most, though, was how dead quiet it was. I killed the engine and sat there for a minute, just listening. No cars, no wind, no night birds. The silence made the hair on my arms rise. I don't know why, but I got out anyway. The air was colder than I expected, damp enough that it smelled like wet leaves and old soil. My boots crunched on gravel, and every sound seemed too loud. I walked up the short driveway, staring at the cabin. I remembered all the times I used to drop her off here, the way she would wave half-heartedly before shutting the door. I remembered how I never once stayed the night inside. She never wanted me to. Standing on the porch now, I saw the lock on the front door was still there, but the wood around it was chipped, like someone had tried to force it open at some point. I leaned close to the window and cupped my hands to block the glare from the moon. The inside looked almost untouched. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and an old quilt draped over the couch. Dust covered everything, but it looked the same as when I had last seen it more than 10 years ago. I don't know what pushed me, but I went around the side. The back door was always flimsy compared to the front, and sure enough, it hung half open. I hesitated for a long minute, then stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like mold and mouse droppings. I pulled my jacket tighter and took careful steps across the wooden floor. Every board groaned under my weight. The place felt colder inside than it did outside, as if the walls trapped the chill. I wandered through slowly, my boots brushing up old dust. The kitchen counter still had an old coffee mug sitting upside down. There was a pan on the stove, blackened with rust. On the small table, a yellowed newspaper was folded, dated 2007. That must have been the last time she came here, around the same time our marriage fell apart. I went into the bedroom and froze. The bed was made, sheets tucked tight, but on the pillow was a single hairbrush, with long strands of brown hair tangled in it. My chest tightened, It had to be hers. I reached out and touched the handle. It was sticky, tacky, as if it had been left in dampness for too long. Something about standing there made me uneasy, like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. I told myself it was stupid. It was just an old cabin. But the silence pressed harder against my ears. I could hear my own breathing loud in the room. I decided to leave, but as I turned, I noticed the closet door was cracked open. It had always stuck when you tried to pull it, but now it hung loose. I pushed it the rest of the way, and a wave of mildew hit me. Inside, the shelves were empty except for a small plastic crate on the floor. I crouched down and pulled it out. Inside were papers, notebooks, and a couple of old photographs. My stomach dropped. They were pictures of me, some with her, some just of me alone, ones I didn't even know existed. In one, I was fixing a fence behind our old house. Another showed me asleep on the couch. I stared at them, my mouth dry. I hadn't seen these before. I flipped through the stack of notebooks, and each was filled with her handwriting, page after page. My name, my routines, little details of what I ate, when I came home from work, the way I tied my boots. I shoved everything back in the crate and slid it into the closet. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My heart was racing now, pounding so hard it made my hands shake. I wanted to believe it was just her way of keeping track of things, maybe some strange obsession, but the pictures, especially the ones I didn't know she took, made my skin crawl. I hurried out of the bedroom, nearly tripping on the rug. My boots echoed on the wood floor as I moved toward the back door, desperate to get out. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Muddy footprints on the floor, faint but fresh. They weren't mine. They led from the back door into the cabin, across the living room, and stopped near the couch. I froze, my ears strained in the silence, waiting for any sound. Nothing, just the tick of my own heartbeat. I backed slowly toward the door, my eyes sweeping every corner of the cabin. The footprints didn't leave. Whoever made them hadn't gone back outside. My throat tightened. I didn't check the bathroom. I didn't check under the couch. I didn't check anywhere. I bolted. I ran out the door, down the porch steps, and across the gravel, not caring how loud I was. I nearly slipped on the wet leaves as I reached my truck. My hands fumbled with the keys, but I finally got inside and locked the doors. I sat there with the engine running, headlights blasting the driveway, waiting for movement. Nothing, just that silent, dead cabin. My breathing wouldn't slow down, and sweat dripped down my back despite the cold. After what felt like forever, I shoved the truck into gear and drove off, not daring to look in the rearview mirror until I was miles away. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to the crate of photos and the fresh footprints. If the place had been empty for years, who had been there? And why were they watching me? Back then, and maybe even now, I never went back. I took a different route every time I drove near that part of the county. Sometimes, late at night, I still see the pictures in my mind, the ones of me asleep, completely unaware someone was standing over me with a camera. I know my ex-wife had her secrets, but what I found in that cabin was something I wish I had never seen. Whatever she was doing there, whoever else might have been involved, I don't want answers anymore. Some things are better left buried in that cold, silent place at the end of the broken road. I was 34 the year I took my dog, Scout, up into the northern woods of Montana. It was the fall of 1997, late enough in the season for the mornings to bite, but not yet frozen through. I had borrowed a friend's cabin about an hour outside of Libby. It was nothing fancy, just a box-shaped wooden structure with a tin roof, a porch that leaned forward like it was tired, and a single chimney that puffed out white when the wood stove inside was alive. Scout was a German Shepherd mix, 6 years old, and big enough to make me feel less alone when I wandered into quiet places like this. He wasn't the type of dog that barked at everything. He was steady, calm, but when he stiffened up at something, I knew it wasn't nothing. That was why I trusted him more than I trusted my own nerves. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, tall pines pressing in on every side. There was an old logging road about a quarter-mile away, but otherwise, it was just trees, brush, and a silence that was so thick you could hear every twig snap, every gust of wind sliding through the branches. I had brought food, water, and enough firewood stacked to last a week. I planned to write, maybe hunt a little, and mostly just get away from the noise of town. The first 2 days passed slow. I split wood, boiled coffee on the stove, took Scout on long walks down through the timber where the sunlight barely touched the ground. He loved it out there, nose down in every track, tail swishing back and forth like a pendulum. At night, he slept near the foot of my cot, sometimes lifting his head when the cabin shifted or the stove popped. I didn't think much of it. Cabins always make their own sounds. It was the third night when things started to feel off. I was sitting at the small table with a lantern lit, writing in a notebook, when Scout's ears twitched. He got up slow, padded across the floor, and stood at the door. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He just stood there, stiff, head tilted like he was listening hard. I set the pencil down and held still. There was nothing at first, just the wind. But then I caught it too. A crunch, faint, like weight pressing into leaves. Not a deer's sharp, quick movement. Slower, more deliberate. I didn't move from the chair. Scout stayed at the door for maybe half a minute, then came back to his spot and laid down again, though his body stayed tense. I convinced myself it was nothing. Could have been a branch breaking or an animal nosing around. I went back to my writing, but my ears never relaxed. The next morning, I went outside to split more wood. Frost covered the grass and my breath came out in clouds. Scout trotted around the clearing, nose working. That was when I saw the marks. About 10 yards from the cabin, near the treeline, the ground was pressed down. Bootprints. Not fresh, but not old either. Someone had been standing there, facing the cabin. I knelt down, looked close. The tread was sharp enough to know it was from the past day or so. Not washed out by rain, not softened by time. Just there, plain as day. My stomach tightened. It wasn't uncommon for hunters or hikers to pass through, I told myself. Still, standing there facing the cabin in the middle of the night, that wasn't passing through. That was watching. The rest of the day, I tried to shake it off. I worked, took Scout for a long hike up the ridge, tried to put distance between the thought and myself. But when the sun dropped and the sky turned dark, that unease came back heavy. I locked the door, fed the stove, and laid down with Scout curled up near me. Sleep didn't come easy. I drifted in and out, my mind running through what I'd do if someone tried the door. Around 2 in the morning, Scout lifted his head. His body went rigid, ears high, nose working the air. I froze. Then came the sound, clear this time. Footsteps in the clearing. Slow, steady. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. The footsteps circled, stopping every so often, like whoever it was kept looking toward the cabin. Scout didn't bark. He just let out a low growl, deep in his throat. I put a hand on his back, more to keep myself steady than him. The steps went on for what felt like forever, then faded back toward the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night. In the morning, I opened the door and scanned the clearing. The frost was broken in several places, footprints all around, circling wide.
No deer prints, no elk.
Just boots, big ones. That day I couldn't focus. Every sound made me jump. Scout wouldn't leave my side. Even when I went to the edge of the clearing to gather kindling, he pressed close, ears still twitching. By late afternoon, I made up my mind. I packed my bag, loaded the rifle I had brought for hunting, and stacked what food I could carry. I wasn't about to wait another night. Something was out there, and I wasn't going to find out what they wanted. The sun was going down fast when I finally latched the cabin door behind me. The trail back to the logging road was narrow, winding, covered in roots and shadows. I moved quick, Scout trotting tight at my heel. The woods felt alive, every crack of a branch making my pulse hammer. About halfway to the road, Scout froze. His nose shot up, then he barked sharp and loud, the kind of bark that says danger, not play. My blood went cold. I raised the rifle and scanned the trees. There was movement, not an animal. A shape, tall, about 30 yards off, half hidden between two pines. I couldn't see details, just a dark outline. It stood still, watching us. I didn't wait. I shouted out loud, firm, not words, just a noise to carry, and leveled the rifle high, squeezing off a shot into the air. The crack ripped through the woods, echoing until it felt like the trees themselves were splitting. Scout barked again, teeth bared. When the echo faded, the shape was gone, vanished back into the trees. I didn't stick around. I grabbed Scout's collar and pushed hard down the trail, half running, stumbling over rocks, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. I didn't look back, not once. By the time I hit the logging road, my lungs were burning. I didn't stop until I reached the truck. Scout leapt in first, still on edge, still looking back toward the trailing. I slammed the door, started the engine, and tore out of there, gravel spitting under the tires. I didn't go back to the cabin. Not that season, not ever again. The next week, I told my friend what happened. He shrugged, said it was probably just hunters passing through. But I knew better. Hunters don't circle cabins at 2 in the morning. They don't stand watching from the shadows. Even now, years later, I think about it sometimes. Those boots in the frost, that shape in the trees, the steady footsteps in the clearing. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. But I know this. If Scout hadn't been there warning me, maybe I would have tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I would have stayed another night. And maybe I wouldn't have left at all. I had worked as a Crown agent for almost 9 years, but I never got used to the places they sent me. My name doesn't matter much, but at the time I was 36, and my assignment in the autumn of 1984 sent me deep into the northern reaches of Scotland, near the Cairngorms. The weather was already starting to turn harsh that year. Cold rains swept across the hills, and the sun dipped too early each evening, leaving the valleys dark and heavy with silence. The file I was handed in Edinburgh was thin, no more than 5 pages. It held only the basics. A missing person report, a man named Robert Mallory, 42, last seen 2 weeks prior. He had been a bookkeeper for a timber company, but for some reason London wanted me to follow up personally. When you're an agent, you don't ask why. You just go. The drive took nearly 6 hours on narrow roads that wound through empty fields and endless woods. By the time I reached the turnoff that led toward the cabin listed in the report, it was late afternoon. The sky was the color of slate, and a fine drizzle blurred the windshield. My car crunched over gravel, and the forest seemed to fold in around me. I remember the feeling of isolation so clearly, like I was being swallowed by the landscape. The cabin itself was small and old, made of dark timber that looked soaked from years of rain. It sat at the edge of a clearing, with the forest pressing right up against its back wall. A single chimney poked upward, but no smoke came from it. The air smelled of wet leaves and something else I couldn't quite place at first. A sour, metallic tang that stuck to the back of my throat. I parked the car a good distance away and walked the last stretch. My boots sank slightly into the damp ground, and each step seemed too loud. There were no birds, no movement in the trees, just the steady tap of rain. I tried the door first, and to my surprise, it wasn't locked. The handle turned easily, and when I pushed it open, the smell inside hit me harder than the one outside. It was the smell of death. I had smelled it before, enough times to recognize it without doubt. The air inside was heavy, clinging to the back of my tongue. I pulled a scarf up over my nose and stepped inside. The floor creaked under my weight, and the wood felt soft in places, as if damp had eaten through it. The main room was simple. Wooden table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with jars that had gone cloudy with age. Dust coated everything, but it was the silence that struck me. Silence has a way of pressing in on you when you're in a place like that. It didn't take long to find him. Robert Mallory's body was in the back room, sprawled against the far wall, half slumped beside a trunk. His skin had gone pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. His shirt was torn, stained dark across the chest, and though the air had cooled the decay, it was clear he'd been there for days, maybe longer. The position of his body didn't look natural. Legs twisted awkwardly, one arm bent behind him. I crouched down, careful not to touch him, and studied the scene. The wound was obvious. A knife, driven straight into his chest, angled downward. Whoever had done it had known exactly where to strike. This wasn't suicide. This wasn't an accident. The problem was, there were no signs of a struggle. The room was neat, nothing overturned. That kind of precision, that calmness, it spoke of someone who had taken their time. Someone who had been close enough to gain his trust. I moved through the rest of the cabin, noting every detail. A tin cup still half filled with water on the counter. A blanket folded on the bed. A notebook lying open on the table. Pages filled with numbers and names I didn't recognize. One detail caught me. A muddy boot print near the back door, larger than Mallory's own boots. The print led outside, then disappeared into the wet ground. Night fell quicker than I wanted. The drizzle turned into steady rain, and the forest grew darker by the minute. My training told me to leave, to secure the area and call for recovery. But something in me hesitated. If I left then, I'd have to drive for hours in pitch black, rain flooding the roads. And worse, if the killer was still nearby, I'd be out in the open. I decided to stay. I set up in the main room, keeping the body in the back with the door shut. I lit a lantern I found on the shelf, though its weak flame only seemed to make the shadows heavier. I sat at the table with my notes, trying to make sense of the numbers in the book. My hands were steady, but I could feel my nerves tightening. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind outside, set me on edge. Around midnight, I heard it. A sound from outside, soft, deliberate. Not the wind, not the rain. A crunch of gravel, then another. Slow steps circling the cabin. My pulse hammered in my throat. I moved to the window and peered through the crack in the curtains, but the darkness outside was complete. Whoever was out there knew how to move quiet. I stayed still for nearly an hour, listening. The steps came and went, sometimes close, sometimes farther, as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. My mind kept going back to the muddy print at the door. I realized then that Mallory hadn't been killed by some stranger passing through. He had been watched just like I was being watched now. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table with my pistol laid in front of me, lantern low, ears straining for every sound. By morning, the rain had stopped. Mist hung low over the trees, and the ground outside was soaked. I forced myself to step out and circle the cabin. That's when I saw them. Fresh prints, larger than my boots, leading away into the woods. Someone had been here close enough to know I was inside. I never found the killer. When recovery finally came 2 days later, Mallory's body was taken, the notes gathered, and the cabin sealed. My report was filed, stamped, and buried somewhere in the archives, another quiet tragedy. But the part that stayed with me wasn't the body or the blood. It was the feeling that night, sitting in the dark cabin with the lantern flickering, knowing there was someone out there just beyond the trees, watching me the same way they had watched Mallory. They hadn't come back for me, but they could have. They chose not to, and that choice was worse than any knife. Even now, decades later, I can still smell that damp wood, still hear the slow steps in the gravel, still feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing in from the black woods outside. Some cases end with answers. This one ended with silence, and a silence like that never leaves you. I drove out into the woods of northern Michigan in late October of 1994. I was 29, working long shifts in a small auto parts factory, and I needed quiet more than anything. My uncle had a cabin about 30 miles off the highway, hidden deep past unmarked dirt roads. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms, a wood stove, and a small porch, but it was away from people, away from machines, and away from noise. The last stretch of road to the cabin was nothing more than a narrow trail cut through thick forest. Fallen leaves covered the dirt, wet from earlier rain, and branches scraped against the sides of my old pickup. When I finally pulled up, the place looked the same as it had years earlier when I was a kid. The siding was dark brown, nearly black now from weather. The roof sagged a little at the edges. The air was colder than it had been back in town, and everything smelled damp, like wet bark and mud. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the weak light that came through the single window. The silence felt heavier than usual, as if the woods themselves were pressing down. I built a fire in the stove, unpacked my few bags, and set about making the place livable for the night. I had no plans other than to rest, read a little, and let my mind go quiet. As night fell, the forest outside turned into a wall of black. No streetlights, no nearby cabins, nothing. Just a sea of trees swaying in the wind. The fire cracked behind me as I sat on the old cot, flipping through a book I'd brought, though my eyes weren't really following the words. My body felt tired in a way I hadn't expected, so I turned in earlier than usual. The cot creaked under my weight, and the stove glowed faintly in the corner. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke up. At first, I thought it was just the fire dying down that stirred me, but then I realized what had broken my sleep. The woods were no longer quiet. I heard movement outside, slow, heavy steps, crushing leaves and snapping twigs, not the quick scatter of a raccoon or fox. This was deliberate, steady, like a person walking in the dark. I held still, barely breathing, listening. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I waited, heart hammering in my chest. For a long time, there was only silence, so deep I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Finally, I convinced myself it must have been a deer or maybe even a bear nosing around, and I forced my eyes shut again. When I woke a second time, the faint gray of dawn was just creeping into the window. The first thing I noticed was the mud smeared across the porch boards. Large boot prints pressed deep, leading right up to the door. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. Not an animal, someone. I stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at my skin. The prints circled the cabin, just like I'd heard in the night. They wandered near the woodpile, then back toward the tree line, and finally disappeared into the forest. The distance between steps was long, purposeful, like whoever it was had been pacing, checking the place. Watching, I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees, waiting to see movement. But nothing stirred. The woods were dead still. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. I chopped firewood, swept out the cabin, and tried to focus on small tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to those prints. I hadn't seen another person since leaving the highway, and I knew no one should have been wandering this far out. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, and rain started to fall in thin sheets. The forest grew darker, heavier. The smell of wet leaves seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls. I sat by the stove, forcing myself to read, trying to drown out the sound of rain drumming on the roof. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind scraping branches against the siding, set my nerves on edge. When night came again, I made sure the door was bolted, though it wouldn't take much to break it open. I left the lantern burning low, too uneasy to sit in full darkness. The rain softened, then stopped, leaving behind an unnatural hush. Sometime deep in the night, the sounds came again. Footsteps, heavier this time, closer. They stopped right outside the door. The boards groaned under the weight. I sat up slowly, the cot creaking, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. For what felt like hours, there was only that silence. Then a soft sound, metal scratching against metal. The doorknob. Someone was trying it, testing it. I stayed frozen, staring at the faint light from the stove, unable to move, unable to breathe. After a long stretch, the knob stopped rattling. The boards creaked again, the footsteps moving away, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin once more. Then nothing, just the black weight of the woods pressing in. When morning came, I barely had the strength to get up. I forced myself to check the porch again. More prints, clearer this time. Heavy boots, mud packed into the grooves. They stopped right at the door, turned, and walked around the cabin twice before heading off into the trees again. I didn't wait around. I threw my few things into my bag, doused the fire, and left. The drive out was nerve-wracking. Every time the trail narrowed, I expected to see someone standing there in the woods, waiting. The deeper I drove, the more I glanced into the mirror, convinced a figure would step onto the road behind me. When I finally hit the highway, I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. My hands hurt from gripping the wheel so tight. My clothes were damp with sweat, even though the air was cold. Later that week, I told my uncle what had happened. He shrugged it off, said maybe it was just hunters passing through, though I could see the unease in his eyes. Hunters don't circle cabins in the middle of the night. Hunters don't try door handles when someone's inside. I never went back to that cabin again. The thought of it still makes my stomach turn. The mud prints, the sound of boots circling, the soft rattle of the knob in the dead of night. Out there, miles from anyone, I realized just how thin the walls are between safety and something far worse. And what scares me most isn't what happened. It's knowing that whoever was out there never wanted to break in, never tried to force their way inside. They only circled, watched, tested, like they were waiting for me to open the door myself. I took the ranger job at Bitter Creek National Park in the fall of 1997. I was 27, broke, and had just walked away from a short-lived construction job that barely paid rent. The ranger position offered me a roof, steady hours, and the kind of solitude I thought I wanted at that point in my life. My station was a small cabin tucked away a few miles from the visitor center, surrounded by thick pine forest and ridges that blocked out the horizon. The cabin itself was basic. 2 rooms, one for sleeping, one for working. A wood stove in the corner, a desk against the wall, and a radio that sometimes worked if the weather wasn't too rough. I had a cot, a thin mattress, and a small shelf of outdated ranger manuals. Outside, the air always smelled of pine needles and damp soil. It felt quiet, too quiet sometimes, but that's what I thought I needed. Most nights were uneventful. My job was simple. Log trail activity, check for signs of poachers, make sure campers stuck to the rules, and keep an eye out for any fires. During the day, I patrolled the marked trails and cleared downed branches. At night, I sat inside the cabin with a thermos of coffee, filling out reports by the light of a single lamp. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. The first 2 weeks went by without a hitch. Then the weather changed. The mornings grew colder, and by October the wind cut hard through the trees. Nights stretched longer, and sometimes I felt the forest pressing in around the cabin. I started noticing small details I hadn't before. Twigs snapping near the tree line when no one should have been there, faint movement in the corner of my eye as I did my evening rounds, and the occasional sound of heavy branches breaking deeper in the woods. One night, close to midnight, I heard footsteps. Not animals, not the random shuffle of deer hooves or the scratching of raccoons. These were heavy, deliberate steps, too close to the cabin to ignore. I killed the lamp, crouched near the window, and listened. The footsteps circled, slow and careful. My stomach tightened as I realized whoever it was wasn't just passing through. They were watching the cabin. After what felt like forever, the sound faded, swallowed by the trees. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. About 20 feet from the cabin, pressed into the soft dirt, were boot prints. Large, deep, and fresh. They circled in a wide loop, then disappeared into the woods toward the northern ridge. I radioed it in to the visitor center, but reception was spotty, and all I got through was that I'd seen tracks near my post. The reply broke up in static, so I let it go. I told myself it was probably a hiker who wandered too close, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I bolted the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and kept the lamp on low. Sleep came in short, broken stretches. 2 nights later, it happened again. Around 1 a.m., I woke to the sound of gravel crunching outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I lay still, ears straining. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing every so often, like whoever it was stopped to listen. I stayed frozen on the cot, barely breathing. The sound dragged on for nearly half an hour before fading. At first light, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. This time, there weren't just boot prints. Near the woodpile, someone had dragged one of the logs a few feet across the ground, leaving a groove in the dirt. A log I had neatly stacked the day before. My stomach turned. Whoever had been out there wasn't lost. They wanted me to know they had been close. The days blurred into a haze of fear and exhaustion. I barely ate, and coffee became the only thing keeping me upright. Every night, I sat in the cabin with my back against the wall, shotgun across my lap, staring at the door. I didn't report it again because part of me worried it would sound like paranoia, and part of me knew the nearest help was hours away. If something happened, I was on my own. One evening, late October, I decided to check the ridge myself. The trail was narrow, littered with roots and slick leaves. I climbed higher, the air sharp in my lungs. About a mile up, I found something that stopped me cold. A crude campsite. No tent, just a fire ring of blackened stones and a makeshift lean-to of branches. Scattered around were food wrappers, empty cans, and cigarette butts. Whoever had been circling my cabin had been living less than a mile away. The worst part wasn't the trash. It was the notebook I found near the fire ring. Spiral-bound, cover torn. Inside, the handwriting was jagged, uneven. I flipped through pages filled with numbers, strange notes, and my cabin's description written several times in different ways. One page had a crude sketch of the cabin itself, with an arrow pointing to the back window. My chest tightened as I realized they had been watching me for weeks, close enough to draw details. I didn't take the notebook. I didn't want whoever it belonged to know I had been there. I backed out of the sight, slow and quiet, and made my way down the ridge without looking back. Every tree felt like it held eyes. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the door with the shotgun, listening to the wind scrape across the roof. Hours dragged by, but nothing came.
No footsteps, no sounds.
Just silence. By morning, I made up my mind. I wasn't waiting this out. As soon as the sun rose, I packed what I could carry and hiked the 3 miles to the service road. My legs shook the whole way, but I didn't stop. At the visitor center, I turned in my gear, left a report on the ridge campsite, and told them I was done. 2 weeks later, I was back in my hometown, working a night shift at a warehouse. The cabin was behind me, but the unease wasn't. I never forgot the feeling of being watched, or the sound of those boots pacing outside while I sat helpless inside. Sometimes I still hear it when I'm trying to fall asleep. Slow, deliberate steps circling in the dark. I've told people the job wasn't for me, that the isolation got too heavy. That's true, but not the whole truth. The real reason I left was simple. Out there, miles from anyone else, I realized something I can't shake. The scariest thing in the woods isn't the silence, or the animals, or even being alone. It's knowing another person has their eyes on you, waiting, and you don't know why. And I knew, without a doubt, that someone had been waiting outside that cabin for me. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to try and build a small cabin on my uncle's land in northern Michigan. I was 26 at the time, old enough to know what I was doing with tools, but still young enough to think I could take on the world without much planning. The land was deep in the woods, down a narrow dirt road that barely fit my old pickup. The trees closed in overhead, tall and heavy with the wetness of the season. The place was quiet except for the sound of wind and the occasional cry of a bird. I had been out there for a few weekends already, clearing brush, stacking wood, and laying down the base logs. The cabin wasn't anything big, just a 12 by 12 single-room shelter that I planned to use for hunting season. No electricity, no plumbing, just 4 walls and a roof to keep the cold out. It was the kind of thing my uncle would have laughed at if he were still alive, but I wanted to do it for myself. That Saturday, it rained steady all day. The forecast had called for showers, but I hadn't expected it to set in the way it did. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the dirt around the cabin site had turned to sticky mud. Every step I took made a sucking sound under my boots. My jeans were soaked through at the cuffs, and the wool jacket I wore hung heavy on my shoulders. My hands were raw from swinging the hammer, slick with rain and sweat. I told myself I'd quit early, but the more I worked, the more stubborn I got. I didn't want to leave the cabin half done. The frame was up, and I had started on the roof beams, but the rain made the wood slick and dangerous. Every time I climbed the ladder, I felt it shift under me. My tools clattered louder than usual, and I kept thinking about how far I was from anyone. If something happened, no one would find me for days. As evening came, the woods grew darker faster than I expected. The clouds were low and heavy, blotting out what little light was left. The sound of the rain on the tarp I had stretched over part of the cabin was constant, drumming in my ears. I set the hammer down and tried to get a small fire going under the lean-to I had thrown together. The matches were damp, and the kindling hissed instead of catching. I crouched there for nearly an hour, striking match after match until my hands stank of sulfur. Eventually, I gave up. With no fire, the air felt colder. My breath hung in front of me, pale in the gray light. I went inside the cabin frame to get out of the wind, sitting down on the damp plywood floor I had laid. The walls were only half done, so the rain blew through the gaps, but it was better than standing outside. I pulled out the sandwich I had packed in wax paper that morning. The bread was soggy, the cheese cold and rubbery, but I chewed it anyway, my stomach growling. As I sat there, I started to notice the sounds around me. The rain had a rhythm to it, but every now and then I heard something else. A crack of a branch, a soft crunch in the wet ground, something that wasn't just water. I told myself it was a deer moving through, maybe a raccoon, but the noises kept coming. A slow, steady shuffle that seemed to circle the cabin. I leaned forward, straining my ears, but the moment I tried to focus, the sound would fade into the rain. I tried to ignore it, but the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. My uncle used to warn me about black bears in that area, especially in the fall when they were bulking up for winter. I hadn't seen one yet, but I knew they were around. I thought about the sandwich I had just eaten, about the scent of food that might still linger. I cursed myself for not being more careful. The light was almost gone by then, and I knew I couldn't make it back to my truck in the dark. The trail was a mile long, narrow and slick, and I'd already slipped twice that day. The idea of walking it by lantern light with the rain pounding down didn't sit well with me. So I decided I'd spend the night in the half-built cabin. I pulled my sleeping bag from the back of the truck and spread it out on the floor. The nylon fabric was clammy against my skin when I climbed in, and the noise of the rain on the tarp overhead was deafening. I shut my eyes, but every sound outside seemed sharper in the dark. The shuffle of something moving, the wet slap of a foot or paw in mud, the heavy thump of weight against the ground. At one point, I heard what I thought was breathing. Not my own, but deeper, heavier, close to the wall behind me. I froze, holding my breath, counting the seconds. The sound faded after a while, but I didn't relax. My hands clenched around the handle of the hatchet I had pulled into the bag with me. I lay there for hours, drifting in and out of shallow sleep, every noise snapping me back awake. Sometime deep in the night, a crash jolted me upright. It was the ladder knocked flat against the mud. I sat there, heart hammering, listening. Nothing followed. No growl, no snap of twigs, just the rain. I stayed awake until I saw the faint gray of morning seeping in through the trees. When daylight finally came, I crawled stiffly out of the bag, every joint aching from the cold. The rain had stopped, but the forest was dripping, water falling from every branch. The ladder lay where it had fallen, half sunk in the muck. I walked a slow circle around the cabin, my boots sinking with every step. That's when I saw the tracks. Not bear, not deer. Human, bare feet, pressed deep into the mud, circling the cabin in uneven loops. The toes were splayed, the prints large, the heels sunk heavy. They weren't old either. The edges were sharp, the water still pooled in them. Whoever had been out there had walked barefoot through the woods in the cold rain, circling me while I sat inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my stomach twist. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The woods were still and silent, except for the steady drip of water. I didn't wait to find out more. I packed my gear fast, shoving the sleeping bag into the truck bed and throwing the tools in after it. I didn't bother to stack the wood or tie down the tarp. I drove out fast, the tires spinning in the mud until they caught. The narrow road seemed to go on forever, every shadow between the trees pulling at my eyes. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't stop until I was 20 miles down the highway, hands shaking on the wheel. I never went back to finish the cabin. A month later, I heard from a neighbor down the road that some squatters had been spotted in the woods that fall. Drifters, maybe, or someone hiding from the law. They never caught anyone, but people found signs. Makeshift camps, fire pits, scraps of clothes. The cabin frame still sits there, rotting away in the trees. Sometimes I think about going back, just to see it again. But then I remember those footprints circling in the mud, close enough that if I had looked out one of the wall gaps that night, I might have seen a face staring back at me, and I decide to let it rot. I still remember the smell of that cabin more than anything else. Damp wood, old hay, and the faint sharpness of rust. It clung to my clothes long after I left, like it had seeped into the fabric. I was 28 at the time, back in 1997, when I decided to drive out to a piece of land my uncle had left behind in rural Kansas. I hadn't seen him much when I was growing up. He was always the odd one in the family, living alone, tending to a farm that never really made money. When he died, I inherited what was left. A few acres of overgrown fields and an old cabin that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. It was late September, a stretch of days where the mornings were cold enough to sting your skin, but by noon the heat came crawling back. I drove out in an old pickup, following dirt roads that seemed like they would go on forever, with no other cars, no houses, just flat land broken up by patches of trees. The cabin sat near the back of the property, surrounded by broken fencing and a field choked with weeds taller than my waist. The wood was gray and warped, the roof sagging on one side. A barn stood nearby, leaning so far I thought it might collapse if I slammed a car door too hard. I didn't expect much from the visit. I told myself I was just checking it out, maybe making a plan to sell the land. But when I got out of the truck, something about the place made me hesitate. The silence was heavy, like the whole world had stopped moving. Even the birds were quiet. The only sound was the wind pushing through the dry weeds, making them hiss. Inside, the cabin was worse than it looked from the outside. The floor sagged in places, and the air was thick with dust. There were old cans stacked in the kitchen, labels faded so much I couldn't tell what they once held. A table sat in the center of the room with one chair, its legs uneven and scratched. In the bedroom, there was a bed frame with no mattress, just rusted coils sticking up like teeth. I found some of my uncle's things scattered around. Boots with cracked soles, a jacket hanging on a nail, a box of nails and screws rusting together. I should have turned around right there, but I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe pride, or maybe just plain stupidity. I decided to stay the night. I wanted to see what the place was like when the sun went down. I rolled out a sleeping bag on the floor, near the window where I could see the barn and the open field. The day passed slow. I walked the property, pushing through the weeds, stepping around holes where animals had dug. The barn was even worse inside than I expected. The roof leaked, and the floor was covered in broken boards and old tools. But what caught my attention was the smell. It wasn't just mold and rot. It was something sharper, like metal and dirt mixed together. In the corner, I found a pile of chains, heavy and rusted, like they'd been dragged across the ground. Nearby, the dirt was disturbed, darker in color, like it had been dug up and filled again not long ago. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my uncle buried trash there, or maybe animals had been digging. Still, the sight stuck in my mind all afternoon. By the time the sun started to drop, turning the sky orange and purple, I couldn't shake the feeling that the place wasn't right. That night, the cold came fast. I wrapped myself in the sleeping bag, listening to the wood creak around me. Every sound felt louder in the dark. The wind rattling the loose boards, the scratching of branches against the walls, the distant howl of a coyote. I tried to close my eyes, but the silence between the noises kept dragging me back awake. At some point, I heard something heavier than the wind, a dull thud, like boots on dirt, coming from outside. I froze. My first thought was a trespasser, someone cutting across the land. I lay still, barely breathing, waiting for it to fade. But the sound didn't move away. It circled the cabin slowly, step by step, crunching through weeds. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a stray dog, but the steps were too steady, too heavy. I thought about the chains in the barn, about the disturbed soil, and my stomach twisted. I sat up as quietly as I could, peeking through the window. The moon was out, pale and thin, but bright enough to light the field. I scanned the weeds, the fence line, the barn. Nothing moved. The footsteps stopped. The silence after was worse than the sound itself. I stayed at the window for what felt like an hour, my eyes burning, my body stiff. Finally, I convinced myself it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks in the silence. I laid back down, though sleep didn't come easy. When morning finally broke, I was relieved enough to pack my things and head out. But before I left, I walked back to the barn. Something pulled me there, like I needed to prove to myself that nothing had really happened. The air inside was colder than outside, damp and heavy. I walked to the corner where the chains were, and that's when I noticed it. The dirt had been disturbed again, freshly. The soil looked softer, darker, like someone had dug during the night. I didn't go any closer. I didn't want to see what might be buried there. My uncle had been a strange man, always keeping to himself, never talking about his past. Standing there in that barn, with the smell of rust and dirt filling my lungs, I started to wonder if there was a reason he'd lived so far from everyone else. Maybe the cabin wasn't just a place he lived. Maybe it was a place he kept things hidden. I locked the cabin door when I left, though the lock barely held. I drove back down the dirt road without looking in the mirror. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the sound of those footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I never went back to that farm. A few months later, I sold the land to a neighbor who didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. To this day, I don't know who or what was outside that night. I don't know what my uncle kept buried in that barn, or why the dirt never seemed to stay still. But I do know this: some places aren't meant to be lived in, and some things are better left where they're buried. And whenever I hear footsteps at night now, even if it's just the creak of a neighbor on the stairs or a branch falling outside, I feel that same tightness in my chest, that same cold in my stomach, and I remember the cabin. I didn't leave that place with answers. I left with something heavier, an unease that's followed me for years, the kind you can't shake no matter how many miles you put between you and where it started. It was late October, 1998, and I had taken a week off from work to drive up into the northern woods of Maine. I was 32 then, and I'd been hunting since I was a teenager. Every fall, I tried to get away from the noise of town and spend time out in the thick woods where I felt like myself again. A friend of mine had let me use an old hunting cabin that belonged to his uncle. He said it was nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, and a wood stove, but it was far enough back in the timber that I'd have real quiet and good land to hunt. That was all I needed. The drive up took nearly 8 hours. By the time I pulled off the narrow gravel road that led toward the cabin, the sun was already sinking low behind the trees. The dirt track that served as a driveway was covered in fallen leaves, and I could tell from the way branches dragged against my truck that nobody had driven up here in weeks. The cabin was small, just 1 story with a tin roof rusted around the edges. A stone chimney rose from the side, and stacked firewood leaned against the wall, damp but usable. Inside, it smelled like old pine boards and cold ash. The floor creaked under my boots. There was 1 cot with a thin mattress, a rough table, a couple of chairs, and the stove. I unpacked my gear quickly: rifle, lantern, sleeping bag, food packed in coolers, and then I set about starting a fire before it got too cold. That first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I lay in my bag listening to the crackle of the stove, the occasional pop of wood settling. Outside, the woods felt alive but distant. An owl hooted once, then silence returned. I slept lightly, waking every hour or so to listen, though I couldn't have said why. Maybe it was just the strangeness of being so far from anyone else. The next morning I got up before dawn. Frost clung to the grass outside, sparkling in the light of my headlamp. I made coffee on the stove, pulled on my orange vest, and set out with my rifle slung across my shoulder. The forest was thick, spruce and birch mixed together, with damp moss underfoot. The silence was heavy, broken only by my boots and the occasional snap of a twig. I hunted all morning, moving slow, watching for deer sign. I found tracks, fresh ones, but never caught sight of the animal itself. By mid-afternoon, the air had warmed, and I decided to circle back to the cabin. That's when I noticed the first thing that felt wrong. The door to the cabin was cracked open. I was sure I had pulled it shut tight that morning. I stood still for a long minute, rifle ready, listening. The woods were quiet again, but in a sharper way now, like everything around me was waiting. I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the cabin looked mostly the same, but something about the way my pack was lying on the floor caught my eye. I had left it propped against the cot. Now it was tipped over, straps spread out across the boards. The cooler was shut, but I thought I saw the latch wasn't clipped. My heart thudded in my chest. I checked every corner of the cabin, but it was empty. Nothing obvious was missing. I told myself maybe I had been careless in the rush of leaving for the hunt. Maybe the wind had pushed the door open. I wanted to believe that. That night, though, sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing small sounds outside, like footsteps in the leaves, slow and uneven. Every time I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window, there was nothing but darkness and the pale streak of moonlight through the trees. The next morning, I went out again. Hunting kept my mind steady. I tracked a buck through the low ground, spotted it at around 100 yards, but the shot wasn't clean, so I let it go. By noon, I was back at the cabin. This time, the door was shut, but when I stepped inside, I noticed the firewood I'd left by the stove was scattered. The chair had been moved just slightly, angled differently from where I'd left it. These weren't things I could easily excuse. My stomach sank. I spent the rest of the day checking the cabin and the woods around it. I looked for tracks outside, and I did find a few partial prints in the damp soil by the sidewall. They were boot prints, not animal. Someone had been there. That night, I built the fire higher, kept my rifle close, and sat up long past midnight listening. Several times I thought I heard movement, faint crunches in the leaves, but always far enough away I couldn't be sure. By the fourth day, my nerves were stretched thin. I hadn't seen another person since I left the highway, and now I was certain someone else knew I was here. Late that afternoon, while I was walking a ridge half a mile from the cabin, I found a pile of deer bones, stripped clean, stacked neatly like someone had placed them on purpose. That sight chilled me worse than the night air. Coyote kill doesn't look like that. Nature doesn't leave bones in piles. I hurried back to the cabin before dark. The whole walk, I felt like someone was behind me, just out of sight. When I reached the clearing, I saw smoke coming from the chimney. My fire had been out when I left. I froze, every hair on my neck standing. My own cabin, the place I was supposed to be alone, had smoke curling from it like a signal. My truck was parked just a few yards away, but to reach it I'd have to cross the clearing in plain view of the cabin door. My rifle felt heavy in my hands. I stood there, crouched low, thinking through what to do. If I ran for the truck and whoever was inside stepped out, I'd be caught in the open. If I tried to sneak closer, I'd risk walking straight into them. The smell of wood smoke drifted over, familiar and wrong at the same time. Finally, I made my decision. I moved low, staying close to the trees, circling wide around the clearing until I reached the back of the cabin. I listened there, heart pounding. I could hear the faint crackle of fire inside, but no voices, no movement. I eased around to the window. Through the dirty glass, I saw the stove burning and, in the chair by the table, a jacket slung over it that wasn't mine. That was enough. I didn't wait to see more. I slipped back into the trees, circled wide, and moved to the truck as quiet as I could. Every step felt like it echoed. When I reached the door, I climbed in, started the engine, and pulled out onto the rough track without looking back. The whole drive out, I kept expecting headlights to appear behind me or someone to step out from the trees to block the road. But nothing came. After an hour of bumping down back roads, I hit the main highway and finally let myself breathe. I never went back to that cabin. I told my friend his uncle's place needed fixing up, but I didn't give him the full story. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know I wasn't meant to be in that cabin alone. The way the bones were stacked, the way my things were moved, the smoke rising when I was miles away, those details stay with me. Sometimes, late at night, when I smell wood smoke drifting on the wind, I remember standing in that clearing, staring at the chimney, and knowing without a doubt that I wasn't alone in those woods. And I'm glad I left when I did, because I don't think I would have walked back out if I hadn't. I don't usually tell this story, mostly because people roll their eyes or assume I'm exaggerating. But every detail is still burned into my memory, no matter how much time has passed. It was the summer of 2016, and I was 29 years old at the time. I had just come off a brutal stretch at work, the kind where weeks blend together and you wake up already tired. A friend of mine mentioned that his uncle had an old hunting cabin in the woods outside a small town in northern Maine. He said nobody used it anymore, that it was just sitting there gathering dust. I figured a few quiet days away from traffic, phones, and constant noise would be exactly what I needed. The drive up took me about 6 hours from Boston. As the roads narrowed and the cell service dropped, I felt like I was peeling away layers of noise and stepping into something raw and untouched. By the time I parked at the dirt pull-off and slung my backpack over my shoulder, I could only hear wind moving through trees and the buzz of unseen insects. The path to the cabin was half overgrown, a thin trail through pines and brush. My boots sank into soft earth as I walked, the smell of damp moss and rotting wood filling the air. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing about half a mile in. It looked like something out of another time. Faded wooden planks, a roof that sagged in the middle, and windows so clouded with grime they were almost opaque. The door hung crooked, but it opened easily enough when I pushed. Inside, it smelled like a mix of mildew and old firewood, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes. Dust floated in shafts of light cutting through the cracks in the walls. There was a narrow cot against one wall, a stone fireplace, and a rickety table with one chair. I dropped my pack and looked around, already questioning if I'd last a night there, but I had come too far to turn back. I swept the floor with a branch I found outside, cleared the cobwebs from the corners, and set up my sleeping bag on the cot. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the clearing in orange light, I had settled in. That first night was strange, but not unbearable. The forest outside was alive with sound. Crickets, the occasional owl, the far-off snap of branches from deer moving through the undergrowth. The cabin walls creaked with the wind, and at one point something scratched lightly against the wood outside. I told myself it was just a raccoon or some other animal. Still, I slept lightly, waking up at every new noise. The second day, I hiked deeper into the woods, following faint deer trails, enjoying the silence. I didn't see a soul. The only sign of people was the occasional rusted can or bottle buried in the dirt. I tried to fish in a nearby stream but had no luck. By evening, I returned to the cabin with sore feet and an empty stomach. I cooked instant noodles over a small camping stove and watched the sky turn dark. That night, I noticed something odd. Around midnight, the forest seemed to go dead quiet. No crickets, no wind, nothing. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps on dry leaves, circling the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, and spaced out, like someone trying not to make noise but failing. My chest tightened as I held my breath. The steps moved around the cabin, then stopped near the door. I stared at the wood, every sense straining. Minutes passed. Then, the sound of something brushing against the wall, like fingertips dragging across it. I clenched my fists and told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear sniffing around. Eventually, the noises stopped, but I barely slept. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The dirt around the clearing was disturbed, pressed down in places. At first, I told myself it was deer tracks, but these were different, longer, narrower, and spaced like human footsteps. I tried to laugh it off, but deep down I knew what I saw. The third night was worse. I had built a small fire in the fireplace, more for comfort than heat. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to the sound of the door rattling softly, like someone testing the handle. My body froze. I stayed still, my eyes locked on the door. It rattled again, harder this time, then stopped. I heard the crunch of footsteps retreating into the woods. My heart hammered so hard it hurt. I sat awake until dawn, gripping a pocket knife I had brought, though I knew it wouldn't do much. By morning, I was done. I decided to pack up and leave, but when I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the far side of the clearing, about 20 feet into the trees, was a pile of stacked rocks. They hadn't been there the day before. At the top of the pile was a dead bird, its wings spread wide. The sight made my skin crawl. Someone had put it there, and it sure as hell wasn't me. I shoved my gear into my pack and started walking fast down the trail toward where I'd parked. The woods felt different, heavier somehow, like the trees were leaning in closer. Every so often, I thought I heard movement behind me, but when I stopped, there was nothing but stillness. My throat was dry, my palms slick with sweat. When I finally reached the pull-off, my relief vanished. My car sat where I had left it, but the driver's side door was wide open. I knew I had locked it. Inside, my glove compartment was dumped out, papers scattered across the seat. Nothing major was missing. My wallet, phone, and keys were still there, but the fact that someone had been inside was enough to make my stomach twist. I got in, slammed the door, and drove without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station 2 towns over. Only then did I let myself breathe. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every creak in my apartment made me tense. I kept checking my locks 4 times before bed. Eventually, the fear dulled into a kind of unease that still lingers whenever I'm alone in a quiet place. I never went back to that cabin, and I never asked my friend about it again. The only thing I know for sure is that someone had been out there with me, watching, circling, testing the walls of that cabin in the middle of the night. I think about those footprints in the dirt, the dead bird on the stones, and the open car door. It wasn't ghosts, it wasn't anything supernatural. It was something far worse. Someone real, someone who wanted me to know they were there. And to this day, that thought unsettles me more than anything else ever has. I never planned on going inside that cabin. I was 28 at the time, living in rural Montana, just outside a small town where everyone knew each other's business. It was late September of 1998, and the weather had already started turning cold. The air felt sharp in the mornings, and the leaves were drying out, crunching underfoot like old bones. I had been out hunting alone in the woods, carrying only a rifle and a pack with some basic gear. I wasn't deep in the wilderness, just a few miles off a dirt road I knew well. I had followed a trail farther than I meant to, looking for deer tracks. The woods were quieter than usual, no birdsong, just the steady rustle of wind through pine branches. That's when I first noticed the cabin. It was tucked away behind a tangle of trees, so weather-beaten it blended into the woods. The roof sagged badly in the middle, and the wood siding was gray and splintered, nearly the same color as the rocks and dead leaves around it. The windows were filthy, streaked dark with years of rain and dirt. It didn't look lived in, not for decades at least. I should have just walked past it, but curiosity got the better of me. People in town sometimes mentioned the old ranger's cabin out there, though no one had ever said exactly where it was. Some said it had been abandoned in the 70s after a man stationed there disappeared during a storm. Others claimed squatters used it once in a while, though I'd never met anyone who admitted to going inside. I stepped closer, crunching twigs under my boots. The front door was cracked open, hanging loose on one rusted hinge. It looked like it would fall off if I touched it. I stood there for a minute, listening. The woods were dead silent. No wind, no squirrels darting around, not even the distant cry of a hawk, just stillness. Inside, it smelled of rot and old wet wood. The floor was warped, boards bending under my weight. A few broken chairs were scattered across the room. Their legs snapped and splintered. An old wood stove sat in the corner, rusted through at the bottom. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, once probably white but now stained yellow and brown. I noticed small details that didn't fit with the idea of a place completely forgotten. There was a pile of ashes in the stove, not fresh but not ancient either. A dark blanket was crumpled in the corner, stiff with dirt. Empty food cans were stacked neatly against the wall. Beans, soup, corn. The labels were faded but not gone. Someone had been staying there, and not too long ago. That thought made my stomach knot up. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but I stayed, moving deeper inside. There were 2 small rooms in the back. The first was empty except for a broken mattress, its springs poking out like sharp ribs. The second room was worse. The door was stuck, and I had to shoulder it open. The smell hit me first, stronger rot, almost metallic. The window in that room was covered with old newspaper, taped over so no light came through. On the floor, there was a dark stain that had seeped into the wood. It was thick, uneven, and spread wider than I wanted to imagine. I knew what it looked like, but I didn't let myself say the word in my head. Next to it was a bundle of clothes, torn up and stiff with the same dark stain. A man's shirt, a pair of jeans, boots tossed in the corner. They looked like they had been left there in a hurry, not folded or put aside, just dropped and forgotten. I felt cold sweat sliding down my back. My mind started racing. Why would someone leave that behind? Why block out the window? Why were the cans stacked neatly like someone was living here, but the clothes abandoned in such a way? That silence outside the cabin now felt heavier. I realized how far I was from anyone else. My rifle suddenly felt useless. It wasn't fear of an animal I felt, but of people, whoever had been here, maybe still nearby. I backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on the doorway, on the edges of the room, on the broken furniture that looked like it had been knocked over during a fight. The air outside felt thin when I finally stepped out. I didn't run at first. I walked fast, my boots hitting the ground harder than I meant to. Every sound I made seemed too loud, like I was alerting someone. The trees all looked the same, the path less clear. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me, like a stick breaking. I froze, gripping the rifle so hard my knuckles turned white. Nothing moved, but that was enough. I started running. I didn't stop until I saw the dirt road through the trees. My truck was parked there, a dull green Chevy with rust around the wheel wells. I threw the rifle into the cab and slammed the door, my chest heaving. I drove straight back into town. I thought about telling someone right away, maybe the sheriff, but the words stuck in my throat. How would it sound? I had no proof, just a gut feeling. A stain on the floor of a cabin that could have been from anything. Maybe it was paint. Maybe the clothes were just junk someone left behind. Maybe the cans were from some drifter years ago. But I knew better. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that room again. The window taped over, the dark stains spreading across the wood, the abandoned clothes. I kept thinking about how quiet it had been out there, like the whole forest was holding its breath. The next day, I finally did tell the sheriff. He listened, didn't say much, then promised to check it out. A week later, I asked him if he found anything. He just said the place was empty. No mention of stains, clothes, or cans. Just empty. I knew he was lying. After that, I never went hunting near those woods again. I stuck closer to the main road where I could see other people sometimes, where the trees didn't close in so tight. Still, every fall when the air turns sharp and the leaves start to crunch underfoot, I think about that cabin. I think about the room with the window covered and the silence that pressed in like a weight. I think about the clothes left behind, torn and stiff. And I think about the sheriff brushing it all aside, telling me it was just an empty cabin. I know what I saw, and I know someone else had been there, doing things that cabin walls still remember. That place wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by something far worse, something human. And that's why, no matter how curious I get, I will never step inside an abandoned place again. I rented a small cabin in northern Arizona back in the fall of 2012. I was 29 then, living in Phoenix and working a job that barely let me breathe. The idea of being somewhere quiet, away from the heat and the traffic, sounded perfect. I found the place through a friend of a coworker. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-bedroom cabin sitting in a clearing about a half-mile from a gravel road. It had a wood stove, a water pump out back, and a roof that looked like it had been patched with every type of metal sheet possible. The cabin sat at the edge of the Coconino National Forest, and the first thing I noticed when I arrived was how quiet everything felt. The kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. No cars, no sirens, no constant hum of air conditioners. Just wind in the trees, the occasional bird, and the creak of the cabin settling when the sun shifted. I stayed there for 2 weeks, and the first few days were peaceful. I stacked firewood, cooked simple meals, and hiked in the afternoons. At night, I would sit on the porch with a lantern, sip a cheap beer, and watch the stars. Felt good, like I had finally unplugged from everything. But by the fourth night, something started to feel off. It was around midnight, and I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard something moving outside. Not the scurrying of a raccoon or the light step of a deer. This sounded heavier, slower, like someone walking barefoot on damp ground. I held my breath and listened. The sound circled the cabin, steady but irregular, sometimes close, sometimes pulling away. I told myself it was probably an elk. Still, my chest stayed tight until the noise stopped. The next morning, I went out and checked. The dirt around the cabin was damp from rain 2 nights before, and I saw prints. Not animal prints, not boot tracks either. These looked like bare human feet, long and wide, sunk deep into the mud. Some toes dragged as if whoever made them was tired or hurt. They went around the cabin twice before heading into the tree line. I wanted to believe it was just some local drunk who wandered too far from the road, but the nearest neighbor was about 2 miles away. Nobody would walk barefoot through that terrain at night, especially in the cold. The next few nights, the noises came back, always around the same time. The slow circling, the shuffling of feet. Once, I swore I heard breathing just outside my bedroom window. I stopped sleeping well. I would wake up drenched in sweat, every muscle tensed, straining to hear if it was still out there. On the 7th night, things escalated. I had just settled into bed when I heard scratching at the back door. Not the quick, sharp claw marks of an animal, but long, drawn-out drags against the wood. I froze. The scratching lasted maybe a minute, then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the heavy flashlight I kept by my bed like a weapon. The next morning, I forced myself to check the door. There were marks, deep grooves that hadn't been there before. They looked like they were made by fingers, not claws. The wood was gouged in 4 straight lines, uneven, desperate. I considered leaving right then, packing up and driving back to Phoenix, but part of me didn't want to look weak. I told myself I'd only imagined half of it. That stress and lack of sleep were making me paranoid. That night, I built up the fire higher than usual, double-checked that every door and window was locked, and tried to settle in. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to a sound that made my stomach flip. It was someone trying the handle on the front door. Slow, deliberate turns, metal clicking softly under pressure. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, ears straining. Then it stopped. I waited, every nerve lit up, until I heard something else. A voice, not clear words, not a conversation, just a low mumbling. It sounded like someone standing right outside, speaking in a monotone. It was too soft to understand, but the rhythm was wrong, like they were trying to sound human but didn't quite know how. I didn't move until sunrise. My head pounded from the lack of sleep. My hands shook as I made coffee, staring out the window, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. But nothing moved out there, just the stillness and the cold morning air. The second week was worse. Every night something came. Sometimes it was the footsteps, sometimes the voice. Once, I heard tapping on the glass of the kitchen window, slow and steady, like a finger drumming. Each time, I forced myself not to react, not to open the door, not to look outside. One night, about 2 days before I left, I broke. The noise had been going on for hours, circling, dragging feet, and then that low mumbling. I snapped. I grabbed the flashlight and yanked the front door open, shining the beam into the clearing. The light caught movement at the edge of the trees. A tall, thin figure standing just beyond the clearing, too far to make out clearly but close enough to see it wasn't right. Its shoulders were hunched, its arms too long, hanging low. The beam caught its eyes for a second, and they reflected like an animal's, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. Stayed there, motionless, staring straight at me. I stood frozen, my breath fogging in the cold air, until I forced myself to slam the door shut and push the table in front of it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The morning I left, I didn't bother cleaning up. I threw my bag in the car and drove until the cabin was a speck in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. When I got home, I told myself it had been some local messing with me, some tall, thin man living rough in the forest. Maybe someone with nowhere else to go, surviving however he could. That explanation didn't settle right, but it was the only one that made sense without drifting into stories I didn't want to believe. I never went back. I still think about it sometimes, late at night when it's quiet. I picture those tracks in the mud, the scratches on the door, the voice that sounded almost human but not quite, and those eyes staring back at me from the trees. Whatever it was, it wanted me to open the door. And I know if I had, I wouldn't be here writing this now.